If you want extreme 1080p performance in AAA titles, or you want to play competitive titles at 1440p resolution with the high average frame rate, and you don't want to spend over $1,000 in order to get it, then this build is for you. In this video, I'll go over all of the parts I use to build this $800 gaming PC, and you can find the links to each of these components in the description below. I'm also going to walk you through how to build this PC step by step in detail. Even if you've never built a PC before, with this video, you'll be able to build this system easily. And I'll show you the benchmarks so that you can get a good idea of how this build will perform for you. To start off the part list, this build comes with an AMD Ryzen 5 5600X processor. Now I know what you're thinking. Brent, a Ryzen 5 5600X? It's 2024, get an AM5 CPU. Yes, that's true. I could have gotten an AM5 CPU like the Ryzen 5 7600, or if I was feeling adventurous, I could have purchased a Ryzen 5 7500F from China on AliExpress. However, the extra cost that it would have taken to get a decent B650 chipset motherboard and DDR5 memory to pair with an AM5 CPU ultimately swayed me to the 5600X. And this is the kicker. I was able to pick up the 5600X from Amazon on sale for $120. That is an excellent deal. Now you might say, well, that's all well and good, but if you go with the 5600X, then you're just building on a dead socket and you won't have any viable CPU upgrade paths. But that's not entirely true either, is it? With AMD's new 3D V-Cache processors, I could easily swap out the 5600X in this build for either the 5700X 3D or the 5800X 3D, both of which can offer nearly as good of an in-game experience as AMD's new AM5 CPUs, especially at higher resolutions. So while the 5600X may have been a different route than others would have gone with this build, it allowed me to redirect a lot of the money in my budget to put towards the rest of the build, and especially towards the one component that will really make the biggest impact on our in-game experience, the GPU. Now I'll get to what GPU I used in this build in just a second, but first let's go over my motherboard choice. Since I was building on the AM4 platform, I really wanted to make sure that I chose a motherboard that had a solid power design so that I had the option to upgrade the 5600X to a Ryzen 7 5800X 3D down the road. I also ended up choosing a micro ATX case, so I needed a micro ATX motherboard. And of the options out there, I really like Gigabyte's B550M Aorus Elite AX. It's got a nice 5+3 phase power design, something a bit more advanced for a sub $100 motherboard, and that should be good enough to allow us to accommodate the 5800X 3D in the future. It also has a large MOSFET heatsink, which helps it stand out a bit aesthetically. And it comes with dual M.2 ports, which is also tough to find on a budget-oriented micro ATX motherboard. All in all, it's a solid motherboard at a decent price. I could have skimped here and chosen a stripped-down B550 chipset micro ATX board, or even an A520 chipset board, but those would have limited the upgradability of the system. For memory, I chose a 16GB DDR4 kit from Team Group. This is their Vulcan Z line of memory, and you can pick it up on Amazon for about $38. Basically, this is one of the more affordable 16GB 3600MHz kits available. It does have a latency of 18 though, and so if you can find a 3600MHz CL16 kit for the same price or even a little more, that would be a better option. For the SSD, I chose Lexar's Gen 4 NM970 NVMe drive, mostly because it was on sale for $72 on Amazon, and it came with a heatsink. But it also benchmarks well when compared to other similarly priced Gen 4 SSDs. There are a lot of SSD options out there though, and I could have probably saved an additional $10 or so by opting for a Gen 3 drive instead. And in doing so, I probably wouldn't have noticed any significant real-world performance losses. But since our motherboard offers PCIe 4.0 support, and because I had enough room in the budget, I opted for this Lexar SSD. I also chose the Sigotep GM750 to power our build. This $80 750 watt power supply will be able to handle this system without any problems. It's also fully modular, which will help quite a bit with the build process and with cable management. Now, there haven't been a lot of in-depth reviews done on this power supply, which I typically look for before I choose a power supply, but it has received an 80+ gold rating for efficiency, and it's both ATX 3.0 compliant and PCIe 5.0 ready. And more importantly, it's received another gold rating for efficiency and an A- rating for noise level from Cybernetics. If you don't know who Cybernetics is, they're essentially a better version of the 80 Plus program, and they put power supplies through much more thorough and rigorous testing. So even though Sigotep isn't as well known of a power supply brand, their gold rating for efficiency from Cybernetics is enough for me to feel very confident in this unit. I also chose this $22 single tower Thermalright CPU cooler. This is Thermalright's Assassin Spirit 120 Evo cooler. Now I could have skipped adding this cooler altogether. The 5600X will run fine on its stock cooler, but I like the all black design and the ARGB fan that it comes with. And I used Thermalright's Burst Assassin 120 ARGB cooler in the $1,000 build I put together a couple of months ago, and I had good success with that, so this one seemed like it would be a good option for this build. Now let's get to the case I used in this build because I'm kind of excited about this one. This is the Okeanos Aqua 3. I picked this case up for $60 on Amazon. It has 3 ARGB fans pre-installed, 1 on the back and 2 on the top. All of the fans are connected to an ARGB controller, and they're also all pre-connected to a 3-way fan splitter, so I will only need to use one of the fan headers on my motherboard. I really like the tempered glass front panel and side panel. It seems like a lot of cases are going for this look now. I also like this bottom cabinet area where the PSU will be housed. It's got a steel mesh covering that wraps around to the front. Other than that, everything else on this case is fairly standard. It's a micro ATX case, so it is a bit more compact than your traditional mid-tower case, but it can still hold graphics cards up to 330mm long, which is enough room to house some high-end graphics card options. And speaking of graphics cards, let's get to the graphics card we chose for this build. To maximize gaming performance for our $800 budget, I chose XFX's Speedster Quick 319 Core Gaming Edition RX 6750 XT for about $310. Now I really tried to go even further on the GPU. I tried to fit in an RX 6800, another XFX Speedster Quick card, which was priced at about $370. However, I would have had to make room for an additional $60 in the budget, which would have meant downgrading other areas of this build. I would have had to forgo the CPU cooler altogether. I would have had to choose a bare bones motherboard, which would have limited our CPU and storage upgrade potential in the future. And I would have had to drop down to a Gen 3 SSD, which that wouldn't have been that big of a deal. But the XFX RX 6800 is also longer, measuring in at 340mm long. So it would not have fit in the Aqua 3, and there aren't a lot of sub $60 cases that can hold it. So I would have had to make some significant sacrifices in order to fit the 6800 into this build. I think it can be done for anyone looking to really maximize your in-game performance, but I didn't want to go that route. Ultimately though, the 6750 XT is a very strong GPU, and it's one that will deliver ideal performance at 1080p resolution across any game that's AAA titles, competitive titles, whatever. And for 1440p gaming, it should handle demanding AAA titles well enough, while also offering excellent performance in non-demanding competitive titles. So you should be able to use this build for either 1080p or 1440p gaming. But I'll get to the benchmarks and show you how this build performs in just a minute. For now, let me take you through the step-by-step build process for this system. I always like to start my builds with a large, clear workspace. The only tool you'll really need to build a PC is a Phillips head screwdriver. I recommend using a long magnetic screwdriver. It's a lot more difficult to mount your motherboard without one because it can be really tricky to get these tiny screws into place with your hands, as there may not be enough room. But with a magnetic screwdriver, you can lower the screw into place while it is attached to the screwdriver. For most PC builds, it's also a good idea to have the motherboard manual close at hand. However, in the case of this build, it didn't actually end up being helpful. Usually the motherboard manual will tell you which slots to install your memory in, and also where to plug in your front panel connectors. However, this Gigabyte motherboard has this information printed directly on the board itself. The first thing I do with my builds is to prepare my case. For this case, I'll take off both the side and front glass panels to give us more room to work with. To remove the side panel, you just remove these 2 screws. The panel sits in grooves so it won't fall out when you unscrew both screws. Once the screws are removed, you just slide it backwards and pull it out. Handle these glass panels with care and set them aside somewhere safe. The second panel can just be popped right out of place. On the other side of the case, we'll just remove the back panel. Again, unscrew the 2 screws, and the back panel will slide backwards and out. You'll also want to remove the white box from the storage bay. This box comes with a bag that has a bunch of zip ties for cable management, extra expansion slot covers, and all of the screws you'll need to mount your motherboard. You're going to need to grab 2 of the motherboard standoffs from this bag because we'll need them to install our motherboard into this case. Your case's manual is also in this box, and it covers how to install your motherboard, graphics card, additional fans, and storage devices, among other things. There's also a storage bay if you want to install a 3.5-inch drive, but I won't be using this bay, so I'm going to take it out in order to clear out as much space for our power supply and its cables as possible. You can remove it by flipping the case over and unscrewing these 2 screws completely, and by loosening these 4 screws just a bit. Note that I actually tried to remove all 6 screws, but again, that isn't necessary. Once these screws are removed and loosened, you can remove the storage bay from the case. For this particular build, we'll need to change the motherboard standoffs a bit. This one right here will need to be moved to the hole below it. And we'll need to add motherboard standoffs in these 2 locations as well. Again, you can find the additional motherboard standoffs in the bag that was in the white box. At this point, I like to look at all of the cables and start to get an idea of where everything is going to plug in. For this case and this build, there are a number of things to take into consideration. First, this case comes with an ARGB fan controller pre-installed that will require a SATA power connection from our power supply. This is important to note because we will need to remember to install a SATA power connector into our fully modular PSU before we install it into our case. We'll end up connecting the ARGB connector from the RGB controller to either here or here on our motherboard, most likely this bottom location. The ARGB controller can also be controlled by a button on the side of the case, but this cable, labeled LED SW for LED switch, has already been pre-connected to the ARGB controller. And there is an available 3-pin ARGB header on the controller, so we will be able to connect our CPU cooler's ARGB connection to the RGB controller in the case so that all of our ARGB lighting is connected to this controller. This case also comes with a 3-way fan splitter pre-connected to all of the case fans. This will allow us to use 1 fan header on our motherboard for all 3 of the case fans. We'll plug this into the System 2 fan header on our motherboard, and that will give us control over the speed that these case fans operate at. And of course, we'll end up plugging in the CPU cooler's fan into the CPU fan header near the top of the motherboard by the CPU socket. For the front panel connectors, of the smaller connectors, we'll only need to install the power switch and power LED, which will go here on the motherboard. There are no reset switch or HDD LED connections for this case. There's also the HD audio connector, which will allow us to connect our audio devices to our case's front panel, and that will be plugged in here on our motherboard. And there's the USB 3 connector, which will allow us to use these 2 USB 3 ports on the front of the case, and that will be plugged in here on our motherboard. This case does also come with a USB-C port on the front panel and a USB-C connector. Unfortunately, the motherboard we chose doesn't have a USB-C header on it, so we will not be able to use this port. You could get a USB 2 to USB-C adapter to make this port work, but you will be limited to USB 2 speeds. Or you could get something like this M.2 adapter that should give you full USB-C speeds, but it will take up your additional M.2 port and will prevent you from being able to install additional NVMe drives in the future. I'm fine leaving the USB-C port on the front panel unconnected, as there is enough USB 3 ports to handle all of our devices. Another thing I wanted to point out that is a really nice feature of this case is that they use all black cabling for these connections. You'll often find these budget-oriented cases, and even some higher-end options, use the multicolored cables for these front panel connectors, and it's something that stands out and not in a good way. So props to Okanos for getting this right. Now, just to reiterate, we didn't actually connect anything here. We'll do that after we've installed the motherboard, but we wanted to show you how we think ahead to how all of the cables from the case will get plugged in, so that it's easier when we go to actually plug everything in. Also note that we didn't cover any of the connections from our power supply. We'll get to those in just a moment. Once I've got a good idea of how the case's cables will get plugged in, the next thing I usually do is install the motherboard's I/O shield. However, the Gigabyte motherboard that we chose has the I/O shield pre-installed, so we can skip this step. But now we'll move on to installing the power supply. Since we have a fully modular power supply, we'll need to pre-connect all of the cables we'll need. So let's go through each connection. We're going to need the 24-pin motherboard power connection to give power to our motherboard. It installs here on our power supply. This side of the cable is actually 28 pins. The other end, the 24-pin end, will be connected to our motherboard here. We're going to need a single 8-pin CPU power connection to send power to our processor. This cable will install in either of these two ports on our power supply. The other end will be connected to the CPU power port on our motherboard here. We'll also need two 8-pin PCIe connections to power our graphics card. They will connect here and here on our power supply. And the other ends of these cables will get connected in these two ports on our graphics card. And as we mentioned earlier, we'll need a SATA power connection in order to send power to our RGB controller, which will then power our RGB lights on our fans. We'll plug in the SATA power into one of these three ports. Then we'll connect the other end to the SATA cable coming off of our ARGB controller. With all of the cables necessary for our build connected to our power supply, we can now install it into our case. We're going to need 4 of these screws ready to secure the power supply into place. These came in a little plastic bag with the power supply. With the back panel of our case removed, we'll push all of the case's cables out of the way. We'll take our power supply with the fan facing downward and the power port facing towards the back of the case and insert it into the bottom of our case here. Once the power supply is in the case, we'll swing around to the back of the case and use those 4 screws we got out to secure the power supply into place. We can also connect power to our RGB controller now. Take the SATA power cable from your power supply and connect it to the SATA power connection coming from your RGB controller. With the power supply installed, we can now install our CPU, memory, NVMe SSD, and CPU cooler onto our motherboard. We'll do all of this outside of the case and we'll do it on top of our motherboard's box. So make sure you unbox your motherboard and remove anything you'll need for the build from it. The first thing we'll do is remove the CPU cooler brackets. You just unscrew these 2 screws on each bracket and they will release and you can pull them off. Now we'll install the CPU. It's going to go right here in this socket. We need to release this lever, so we'll push it down and away from the socket and it will raise up. To install the CPU correctly, we first need to make note of what corner the triangle on the CPU is and what corner the triangle on the socket is. We'll line up the triangles to install our CPU in the correct orientation. Once you've got the correct orientation, you're going to slowly lower the CPU into the socket. You should feel it slide into place. From there, you'll just push the lever down and lock it back into place. Your CPU is now installed. Next, we'll install our memory kit. We have 2 sticks of memory and 4 DIMM slots. Which slots should we use to install our memory in? Typically, you'll need to consult your motherboard's manual to see which slots you need to fill up first. However, this information is printed directly on our motherboard. You can see right here that it says to install our memory in slots A2 and B2 first. So that's the 2nd and 4th slots. To install your memory, first unlock these levers on your DIMM slots by pushing them down. Then grab your first stick of memory. Your memory can only be installed one way as indicated by this notch. Notice that the notch is offset of center. So you can hold your stick of memory over the DIMM slot and check and see if the notch lines up. For this build and this particular kit of memory, the correct orientation will have the T-Force logo facing away from the CPU socket. Once you have the correct orientation, lower the memory stick into the slot. You will need to apply force in order to seat the RAM properly, and you will know you've done so when you hear a clicking noise. After you've installed your first stick of memory, do the same with the second stick of memory in the fourth slot, the furthest from the CPU socket. Your memory is now installed. Next, we'll move on to installing our NVMe SSD. The NVMe SSD will get installed into this slot. You want to make sure that you insert it into this slot on your motherboard and not this slot, as this higher slot will offer you PCIe 4.0 speeds, and the other slot will only offer you PCIe 3.0 speeds. You probably wouldn't notice a difference in terms of real-world performance either way, but we paid for a Gen 4 SSD, so we're going to make sure that we get any gains that can be had from PCIe 4.0 by installing our drive into the PCIe 4.0 slot. Our SSD will be held into place by this tiny screw. First, we need to remove it from the motherboard. Now we can insert the SSD into the M.2 port. Once the SSD is installed, you can then screw it into place. This is another instance where a magnetic screwdriver will come in handy because this screw is so small that it is difficult to get into place. Once screwed in, our NVMe SSD is now installed. We'll now move on to installing our CPU cooler. Real quick, I just want to give you a heads up here to help you avoid a problem that I had with this build. With the CPU cooler installed out of the case, it will end up being very difficult to plug in the CPU power connection once you mount your motherboard to the case. The CPU power connection sits up in this corner of the motherboard. When the motherboard is installed in the case with the CPU cooler attached, there is not a lot of room to get your hand into this corner to plug in the CPU power. So to make this easier, you can do two things. First, you can install the CPU cooler's brackets outside of the case, but hold off on installing the cooler itself until after you've mounted the motherboard in your case and plugged in the CPU power connection. The other option you can do is before you mount your motherboard, pre-route your CPU power connection. You can pre-route it through this slot on the back of your case. Then instead of sliding your motherboard all the way into place, set it about 4 to 5 inches away from the back panel of the case, then connect your CPU power, then slide your motherboard all the way into place and mount it as normal. I was lucky, and after a lot of attempts, I was able to get it connected after I had installed the cooler and mounted the motherboard into place. But it wasn't easy to do it this way, and if you have larger hands, it may not be possible at all to get the CPU power connection in there with the cooler installed. So just something to be aware of if you are building a PC with these specific parts. But now let's get into the CPU cooler installation so you can see the process. The first thing you'll want to do is place these red risers on the 4 threaded slots around the CPU socket. Once you've got the red risers in place, you'll take the 2 black brackets and screw them onto the red risers on both sides. Next, you'll get your thermal paste, which is included with the CPU cooler, and you'll squeeze out a small amount onto the middle of the CPU. There are many different methods that people swear by for applying thermal paste, but dropping about a small pea-sized amount into the middle has always worked fine for me. If you want to see more methods for applying thermal paste, just Google thermal paste application methods. Now that the thermal paste has been applied, we can now mount the heatsink onto the brackets. We'll slowly lower the heatsink onto the CPU, then we'll press down gently onto the thermal paste, and we'll line up the heatsink's brackets with the holes on the heatsink. Then we'll take our screwdriver and screw the heatsink into place. To ensure that the thermal paste spreads evenly, you should only perform a couple of turns of the screw on one side at a time. Then you switch to the other side and repeat that over and over until both sides are tight. Next, you'll want to locate the CPU fan header on your motherboard. It's located here, and then connect your CPU cooler's fan to it. Note that this is not the ARGB connector, but the fan connector that will allow you to control the speed of the fan. We'll connect the ARGB connection to the ARGB controller in our case after we've installed the motherboard into our case. But now your CPU cooler is installed and you can mount your motherboard into your case. The first thing we'll want to do is lay the case on its side. Then we're going to gently grab the motherboard by the heatsink and the edge closest to the DIMM slots, like this. Then you'll slowly lower the motherboard into the case. It's best to come in from this side of the case, then lower it until you're below the case fans, and then move it towards the I/O slot on your case. Again, before you fully slide your motherboard into place, it would be a good idea to make that CPU power connection now. From there, you'll want to use these screws. They have this flat edge that goes around them, and they were in the white box that came with your case. Use these to screw your motherboard into the standoffs. Now your motherboard is mounted, and it's time to start plugging everything in. Now that you've got your motherboard installed, you can stand your case back up. We're going to start by pre-routing all of the cables. Hopefully you've already connected your CPU power cable, but if you haven't, you can route it through this hole here. Then you'll take your 24-pin motherboard power cable and route it through this hole. Our HD audio cable is going to come in from this hole. We'll also use that same hole to put our ARGB connection through too. Our USB 3 cable will come in through here. And our front panel connectors will come through the same slot as well. You'll also use this slot for the single end of our 3-way fan splitter. And you'll also take your two 8-pin PCIe power connectors and route them through this same hole. Also, now is a good time to take the ARGB connection from your CPU cooler and feed it back through to the back panel of your case, and then you can just connect it now as well. Now, I've found that it's really difficult to show how to connect a lot of these cables on camera because my hand always gets in the way. So I've shown these connections outside of the case beforehand to help you better see how it will work. Let's start with the 8-pin CPU power connection, which you may have already connected, but we'll show it to you here anyways again too. What's going to happen here is that you're going to have to bend this cable back 180 degrees like this. And since there's a clip on this connector that needs to line up with the appropriate spot on the port, you'll have to make sure that the clip is face down before you bend it, so that when you bend it, it then lines up correctly. Again, if you haven't already made this connection, in this particular build it's going to be very tricky because you won't have a lot of hand space. Oh, yeah. There, now it's connected. Next we'll move on to the 24-pin motherboard power. This is going to be a similar type of connection to the 8-pin CPU connection, and even though this is a much bigger connector, it should be easier to do because we have a lot more room to work with. You're going to take the connector and have the clip facing towards the motherboard. Then you're going to bend it and manipulate the cable so that the clip lines up correctly on the port. Then you're going to press down firmly to connect it. This one can take some force to get it to seat properly. Obviously don't break your motherboard, but give it a good push until you hear it click. Once seated, you can move on to the next cable. We'll start from the bottom left of the motherboard and then make our way to the bottom right. The first cable we'll connect on the bottom left of the motherboard is the HD audio cable. This can only be installed one way. You can see the pin layout by looking at the bottom of the connector. There's one pin slot missing from the connector, and you'll need to line this slot up with the header on your motherboard, which is also missing a pin. Once lined up, you can just push it down onto the header like this. Again, big props to Okanos for making this an all-black cable, rather than the multicolored monstrosity that other case manufacturers love to use. After the HD audio cable, we'll move over a bit to the right and connect our ARGB controller here. You want to make sure you're connecting this connector to the 3-pin ARGB header labeled DLED1 and not the header labeled LEDC1. The 3-pin ARGB header is the header that will give you full control over your RGB lights. Again, this connector can only be connected one way. Line up the holes on the connector with the pins on the motherboard and push the connector onto the header. After that, we'll connect the USB 3 connector to the USB 3 header. This is a straightforward connection because the header is encased and there's a notch on the connector that makes it so that it can only be installed one way. Simply line up the notch on the USB 3 connector with the appropriate spot on the header and push the connector into place. The one difficult part about the USB 3 connection when you're trying to connect it inside the case is that the cable is stiff and it is hard to get it to bend so that you can actually connect it into the header. The slot in the case that the USB 3 cable goes through isn't quite big enough. However, it's very important that you bend this USB 3 connection so that it isn't sticking up too high. You're going to install your graphics card right above here, and if you don't get this cable down, it will end up getting hit by one of the fans on your graphics card. So once you get it into the slot, make sure you tuck this cable down as far as possible so that it doesn't interfere with your graphics card. Next, we'll move to the very small front panel connectors. Fortunately, since our case doesn't have a reset switch or an HDD LED light, we only have to connect the power switch and the power LED. Typically, you would check the motherboard's manual to see where these two go, but the motherboard's manual doesn't really help us here. However, the motherboard does have the instructions on where these pins get installed right on the board itself. Also, be sure to make note of the plus and minus symbols on both the header and the connectors. So just connect the plus to the plus and the minus to the minus. We'll take the power LED first and install it on the top left 2 pins. The plus pin will go on the left and the minus pin will go on the right. These 2 connectors are separated, and you can either put them on one at a time or you can hold them together and stick them on both at the same time. Just note that on this motherboard there's also a section labeled PWR_LED. This is for specific cases that use a 3-pin connection for their power LED. It can be ignored for this build. Next, you'll connect the case's power button. Both the connectors have been combined into one connector, so you'll just need to orient it so the plus is on the left and the minus is on the right, and then you'll plug it in right next to the power LED. Finally, we'll take the single connector from our 3-way fan splitter and connect it to the SysFan 2 header. Both the header and the connector have a notch to make it so the connector can only be installed one way. You'll line the notches up and push the connector onto the header like this. And that's it for all of the smaller connections. The only thing left to do now is to install the graphics card, connect power to it, and test to see if the system will boot up. To install your graphics card, first you'll want to come to the back panel of your case and find this thumb screw and loosen it, and then you can either slide it to the right or you can remove it altogether. This was screwed on really tight, so it might take some force to get it loose. After that, you need to remove the second and third expansion slot covers. Now, I did get a bit ahead of myself and I actually removed the top expansion slot cover, which I wasn't supposed to, but fortunately Okanos provides additional expansion slot covers, so I was able to replace it. If you've never removed one of these before, this might seem a bit weird, but you're just going to wiggle it back and forth until it breaks off. Again, you're going to take off the second and third slot. Once these are removed, you can install your graphics card. Next, get out 2 of these screws from the bag that came in the white box in your case and keep them nearby. Then grab your graphics card. You're going to line your graphics card up with the chrome-plated PCIe slot here, and you're going to slowly move the graphics card towards the PCIe slot. Once over the slot, you're going to push it into the slot. Then you're going to grab those 2 screws and come back to the back panel. You're going to screw these 2 screws into these 2 holes. It's a good idea to lift up just a bit on the graphics card before you tighten these screws down so that the graphics card stays level. Once you've screwed those 2 screws in, you can put the little panel back in, and you can screw that back in as well. Then you're going to grab your 2 8-pin PCIe power cables and connect them to the 2 ports on your graphics card like this. Your graphics card is now installed. Just a note, because this graphics card is so big, you could deal with some GPU sag here. GPU sag refers to when a graphics card is so big that the PCIe slot can't hold it, and over time it starts to sag down, and it can even damage the graphics card. So in order to combat this GPU sag, a lot of builders will find some sort of a bracket or something to stick under one of the edges of the graphics card to help prop it up so that it doesn't sag over time. The problem with this particular build though is that this graphics card is installed so close to the bottom of the case here that there aren't really any GPU sag brackets out there that will fit underneath it. So you'll have to get creative and find something that will work to prop it up. I'm temporarily using a power brick from my phone charger to hold it up, and that seems to be working fine for now. In any case, the build is basically done, and now all we have to do is to plug it into an outlet, flip the switch on the power supply, and press the power button to see if it boots up. So let's do that now. And there you have it, our PC has booted, and so everything is good to go. Now we just need to install Windows, run Windows updates, install all necessary drivers, and then download any software and games we might require. This video is already lengthy and we haven't gotten to the benchmarks yet, so I'll go over how to install Windows and update drivers in another video. If you are watching this and I haven't put that video out yet, there are a lot of good videos on how to install Windows and update your drivers out there that will help you get set up. For 1080p performance, this build performed exceptionally well. The only game it really couldn't handle maxed out was Starfield, but we were still able to achieve well over 60 frames per second, dropping down to the high setting. This build also struggled with ray tracing on Cyberpunk 2077 a bit, but that's to be expected as even higher end cards struggle to achieve a playable frame rate in Cyberpunk on the ray tracing overdrive setting, even at 1080p resolution. But in the non-ray tracing settings, we were able to run Cyberpunk at the Ultra preset at well over 100 frames per second. Here's a look at the rest of the other 1080p benchmarks. At 1440p resolution, the build did well enough to where you could consider using this PC for 2K gaming depending on the kinds of games you want to run. You will have to turn down the settings in some games, but the system was able to run games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla at maxed out settings at 1440p resolution while averaging nearly 100 frames per second. The build did struggle to run Fortnite maxed out at 1440p resolution, but there's no real reason to run the game maxed out in the first place. And playing on lower presets, we were able to average close to 200 frames per second, which means you could pair this build with the higher refresh rate monitor to gain an advantage. Overall though, the 1440p performance was better than expected. Obviously the build is better suited for 1080p gaming, but 1440p gaming with this PC is not out of the question. If you're interested in building this PC, we've left links to all of the parts in the description below. You can also check out the full benchmarks and check for any updates to this build on our website, techguided.com. But that does it for this video. If you have any questions on the build, let us know in the comments below.